My name is Oskar Wanger, and I'm part of the Planet Texas 2050 as a postdoctoral researcher. My research focuses on bridging atmospheric, ecological, and community-based data to build robust and uncertainty-aware data-driven statistical models of our environment. And today's session is really about a central challenge in climate work. We have more data than ever, from satellites to LiDAR, drones, and AI-driven analytics. But how does that data translate into decision-making and real-world planning around flood risk, wildfire, urban forestry, and cultural heritage? The project you'll hear about today sits right at that interface, linking geospatial analytics with real-world planning. And importantly, this work is not just technical, but it also asks who benefits from these tools and how should they be applied. And so we have a fantastic interdisciplinary group here today, which I've had the pleasure of working with myself in the last few months. We have Patrick Bixler from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, working on governance and environmental policy. It's all the way over at the end of this table. And we have, I'm going to mess up this last name, Mark Coder, with the City of Austin, bringing a practitioner perspective. And we have Tim Keat from the College of Natural Sciences, focusing on ecological systems and modeling. We have Dave Nyogi from the Jackson School of Geosciences, focusing on climate and infrastructure. And then lastly, we have Adam Rubinovitz from the College of Liberal Arts, working on cultural heritage and spatial analysis. So each panelist will give a short presentation, about 7 to 8 minutes. After that, we'll move on to a moderated discussion and audience Q&A. And we encourage all of you to submit questions or vote for, well, initially I was supposed to put up some questions on this Slido app, but I didn't. So I guess you can only post your own questions and then upvote like the questions on there. And the QR code should be up on the screen, so please take time to scan that and submit some questions if you have them. And then with that, let's welcome our first speaker, which will be Mark Coder.
Boom, there. How's everybody doing? I think this might be an old slide deck. Hey, I think you have this wrong slide deck. Should I just go for it? Yes. Oh. All right, well, I had this whole other presentation I was going to give today about how we at the city sort of go through a process of going from data to decision, or from decision we need to data. This presentation is a little bit more about all the things that are impacting the city and how we start to think about it, and maybe we can translate that into decision-making going forward. As you guys know, and as we heard this morning, we do now live in a different era. This is from 2011. This is the Bastrop fire, and actually crossed 71 at some point. And in 2011, we had 90 days over 100. We had snow that year, but we also had a massive wildfire. That was sort of the wake-up call for the city of like, hey, these climate impacts are happening, and they're happening more severely. They're getting more complex. They're getting a lot harder to plan for. And then we should really sort of take these things going forward. But that said, 2011 was a climate impacts that we sort of should have known was coming, right? It was heat, it was wildfire, it was snow. I mean, we had flood in 2013, we had a flood in 2015. We've always lived, put it another way, Austin has always experienced these things in the past. We've had floods, we've had heat, we've had wildfire. But things are getting a little bit weird now, in that we're starting to get these things that we've never had before. In 2014, we got climate projections, and they were like, don't worry about ice and snow, we'll probably never see that again. And then 2021, we had a snowstorm. 2023, we had an ice storm. So now we're getting to this area of like, hey, we're having these extreme events, and then we're having events we never planned for in the first place. which is really, really hard for a city to think about, right? Because we make thousands of decisions every single day. We have 13,000 employees. We have thousands of miles of roads, thousands of miles of cables, electrical cables, water stuff. We have all this stuff, all designed for sort of a past climate. But also, there's a human aspect to this. And I think we sometimes forget, this is, 2013, so 12 years ago, I might do my math wrong, 14 years ago. Think about it like it's the middle of the night, it's 3 a.m., it's Christmas. That's the one. Can I plug that one in? Sure.
You might make a mess.
Okay, I'll finish this thought and I'll go back to that. And what happened, as you guys know, 2013 Halloween flood, all of a sudden, 40 feet of water came through the community, took out 600 homes, impacted lives, and people were mad. They're like, why did this happen? This has never happened before. And part of it was our fault. Part of it was climate change. We needed to sort of turn around and change that conversation. And what we realized then and there is that we have to be thinking about these things going forward, not just as an infrastructure thing, but as a human impact, a human response. So the new reality is that we're getting a lot more shocks, and those are the things that make the news, but we also have day-to-day stressors, like it's 80 degrees today. It was 80 degrees all last week, and it was February. I'm not going to tell you what's going to be hot this year. It probably will. So think about those daily stressors of both heat, air quality, on top of these big events that are happening. So one thing we learned back in 2011 when we had those original climate projections is that simply providing climate projections to city departments was not really how to make things work. Is that we actually had a meeting with a climate scientist. They came, they gave all these maps of uncertainty around the climate and how we do climate projections. At the end of the day, at the end of the presentation, the climate scientist said, well, in 20 years, we're gonna look a lot like San Antonio. And most of the people in the room were like, I've been to San Antonio, it's a nice place. Why should we worry about that? And I think that communication piece is really, really important. But the second piece is that we had to tie it to a decision we had to make, right? Because for us as a city, data is only useful if it's tied to a decision we need to make. Just the way that you make a decision around buying a car or looking at TV, you know what you need, you're gonna find the data for it. You can't just have data and without tied to a decision. It doesn't really work that way. So we did a lot of work to understand, like, how do we start to look at that? This piece, I want you to have this tattooed on your put on your t-shirt. Vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, depth, and capacity. Risk is likelihood and consequence. The reason I'm showing this is because this will sort of play out throughout the next couple slides. So the first thing we did is we went back to those departments and said, let's do a vulnerability assessment. And it's really deductive, it's top down. What are all your assets you own? So 4,000 miles of roads, 3,000 miles of water pipes, all the electricity we own. Which ones are most critical? Which for all your engineers is really hard to do. But anyways, which one's most critical? So if you lost it, a lot of area would be lose water, lose power, et cetera. And then of those, which ones were impacted by climate change in the past? Heat, drought, flood, wildfire, now cold weather. And then from that, you map it, you have conversations with facility owners, and you say, well, what is the threshold at which point it was impacted? And then you tie the climate projections to those thresholds. Make sense? So very deductive. You start with 4,000 items, you get down to like 24, which is really sort of a first step identifying how climate change impacts locations. And then we could say this location will have a 50% of getting flooded again in 20 years or so. And we felt pretty good. We're like, hey, this is great. We figured it out. We got 24 locations identified. But then we looked a little bit further, and we realized that each location is dependent on power, water, roads, communication. It's all interdependent. If you lose one, you lose the other. If you lose that line, you lose those networks, then those assets are no longer useful. This led us, with Dave Nioga and others, to have these internal workshops about the interdependencies of offices, of departments, and how they're impacted by events. If you lose water, what happens to your location? If you lose power during a heat wave, what happens to your staff, et cetera. So then we got with Patrick Bixler, he's going to talk about this, is we started talking about like, well, we know the future is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. How do we make decisions today? for things that are going to happen in the future. Because if you think about it, if you drive around, the infrastructure we're going to use in 20 years, we're building today. So how do we make the right decisions right now for an uncertain future, especially when you're talking to engineers who need specific numbers, right? All engineers are like, give me the number, tell me what to do, we'll build this bridge right here, right now. And it's like, well, I don't know. And I get this question all the time, like, hey, we have a $100 million project, should we not do it? And I'm like, I can't answer those kind of questions. So how do you sort of work with uncertainty? So doing a lot of great work with Patrick, with Deirdre, on sort of thinking about future foresight and how do you make those decisions and how do you change the scenario when something happens, what is that threshold? And then the last thing that I'm thinking about now, because I'm teaching an urban ecology class next fall, is the feedback loop, right? We have a lot of relationships between environment and people and infrastructure, and all those things are interconnected, but there's feedback loops. How do we start thinking about those feedback loops and where are those interventions we actually make a difference? Like, do we water here? Do we plant something here? Do we do something there to actually change the whole process? The challenge is that you end up looking like this and it gets really too confusing and then you get into analysis paralysis, but hopefully we can actually boil it down to something that's useful. Also in this work, we've realized that people are squishy. City departments have their own minds and have their own needs. So we started doing an analysis of like, what are those barriers, and realized it wasn't just one, it was many, many barriers. Like there's generally structural changes that we need to make, like how do you make the business case? Relationship changes, like how do you get departments to talk to each other? All the way down to like transformative changes, how do you change the mindset of people so they think about it first, not just as an add-on? And then the other piece I want to give is, when people come to me with climate data, I usually think about it in 3 different temporal scales. Emergency management, like, is it something I'm going to use in the next 72 hours, like sensors because we have a big event? 1 to 5 years, this is when most of the stuff we have gets built. If you think about our bridges, our substations, our water treatment plants, it basically happens in that area. And then we have long-range planners. A lot of times these people don't talk to each other within the city, but we have a 20-year water plan, water forward. Like those are very different temporal scales, but also very different climate data. So I'm always trying to figure out like, where do I insert it within that? Now this is great, but what am I missing? Anybody? I kind of gave you a hint. Oh, Mia? You're right, the people, the buy-in, right? And something we say in our office, you guys, most of you guys have heard me say this, is that no data without stories, no stories without data. Now, that's easy to say, but really hard to do, because when we start working with community members, it tends to be very boutique, like, oh, we're gonna work with this group, we're gonna do this little thing, and then we step away and we have a million other things to do, and then like, it's really hard to scale that up. How to start to get sort of universal buy-in across all the things we're trying to do all the time. And always thinking about, unintended consequences, like, hey, if we make a decision, what is that compounding issue we're gonna have in the community? And then also, like, we can't go into the community with a deficit-based thinking of like, hey, we're gonna solve all your problems. We need to co-create that, but that also takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, which becomes a little bit boutique. One way we do it is that we start with the people first, right? Like, what is the community guidance? Let them co-create with us. Then sort of bring in the research when we get into like actual place-based discussions, and then get into policy and strategy, which also has, all these things have data, but really sort of how to insert that climate data at the right place at the right time. We do this through the UT City Collab, which is actually these fine people and Heidi and a bunch of other people. This is basically, how do you formalize that connection between the city and UT to make sure that we're thinking about these things going forward? Because we tend to make decisions going forward by looking in the past. It's as if we're looking through a rearview mirror, going down a straight road, and we're like, this is great, nothing's wrong, until we hit a curve, and then we're like, well, now we're in trouble. So how do we start to like rethink that model within the city and start to look at data to make a decision going forward? We do have a little bit of funding. Our fiscal year starts October 1st. So every October 1st, we're like, do we get funding this year? And then when we do, we're like, yay. And then we move forward. With the current budget issue, I'm not sure that will happen in the future, but here's for wishful thinking. That is tied to, we have 3 city staff at the city. We have a handful of people at UT who get together every 2 weeks to talk about these things. We do have an advisory team of like assistant directors and associate deans. And then we should make sure that all the projects are tied to weather, have a direct, or climate, have a direct impact to the city, have a positive impact on Travis County, and then have at least one person at the city and one person at UT who are the principal person of contact. Quick overview, this is the projects from last year, or this year, 2024, 2025, so they're still ongoing. You heard about the forest health. You've heard about wildfire mitigation this morning. But we also have scenario planning, which Patrick can talk about, and then we look at building carbonization, looking at demolition permits to see greenhouse gas emission reductions from that. And then right now we have brand new projects that started 4 weeks ago on indoor heat, looking at, and when we do weatherization, how do we measure indoor and outdoor heat before, during, and after that we give free weatherization to community members. City inundation maps, risk map, I think Alyssa mentioned this as well. Cool Pavements, which is Dave Nyogi and Trevor's project, which is fantastic. But then the Cool Pavement one came up as like, well, what is the water quality impacts of using these new technology of a cool pavement? So now we have a project on cool seal and water quality, more work on preservation, continue to work with trees. We have work with airport, and then we also have data decision, which continues Alyssa's work. I have no idea where my time is, but that's my last slide.
Welcome. So I'm going to talk about some work that's been happening in my lab over the last few years and my involvement with Planet Texas 2050. I lead the Resilience in Species and Ecosystems project, and we've been looking at changes in the environment, how we can model and understand them. I'll talk a moment about this, but I want to start out to just saying that, I think it's great that it's been really a lot of fun to work with. I'm just going to start my timer. Folks in Planet Texas 2050, because it is at this university and our collaborators outside the university, a fascinating story in holistic thinking, right? And that doesn't always happen. Often we're driven towards, reductionist and very fine scale things. But this project has been very interesting, and people gravitate towards systems. And so each of the people talking, you can see that they're looking at connections in between things. And so biodiversity is part of that. I want to emphasize, biodiversity is not a passive along for the ride with the rest of us, and it's very much integral to our future and our resilience and well-being. And so, a lot of Planet Texas 2050 kind of originated out of thinking about, engineering approaches and infrastructure and so on. And I would say biodiversity is very much a part of our infrastructure in a sense, and an active part. And the byproducts of biodiversity, including things like soils, and shade and gas exchange and clean water, and all of those services, the support of agriculture, are huge economically valuable. So we really need to understand what's going on in the natural world around us to make better predictions and to better utilize that information when we're building these strategies for greater resilience. And so one of the things we've keyed in on a lot in terms of change is this pattern of tropicalization. In climate change studies, there's been a great deal of work appropriately at high latitudes because they're warming very fast. But in terms of species on the move, the movement out of the tropics into the subtropics is a huge untold story in some ways. This paper very elegantly demonstrated a lot of this in Florida and in Texas and California and Arizona and so on. Species are moving, and because there are a lot more species in the tropics than in the high latitudes, it's a lot more biodiversity moving and a lot more chance for complexity in these interactions. We really don't have a powerful basis. We have a lot of good theory, but we haven't integrated it at this kind of scale and this complexity to really make predictions about new species that are coming in, and we don't know maybe what's going to happen, including things that directly impact us, like disease and so on. So that's an ongoing process. In doing that, we've been doing some work on green jays in Texas. You heard some about that from my student Brian. And they're one of these tropical associated species. They're from Nicaragua, and they're sort of in the Yucatan, and then coming up just to the edge of Texas. Well, they've expanded tremendously in recent years, which we believe to be from anthropogenic causes, climate change, but also land use change. So we've done a large study to sample these across Texas. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the other thing that we've been doing is thinking about, well, so there's so much change happening around us. How can we monitor this? We can't be, as ecologists, in the field all of the time. And while our experience in the field is vital, we have to go home and eat and do other things. So what happens when we're not there in the field? And so we've been working on this idea of having autonomous sensing systems that we monitor the environment 24/7, continuous sentinels. They record temperature, humidity, CO2, other things. But they also record sound, and we can learn a tremendous amount about environments and ecology from listening. We listen to these sounds, and we identify particularly what bird species are singing, but we can do the entire landscape, soundscape. So again, about green jays, this is kind of this remarkable thing where the historical range was really the species restricted to the lower Rio Grande Valley, and now it's around San Antonio, out to Del Rio, and east over to around Victoria. And so we've sampled birds, banded, taken blood samples throughout this range for genetic studies, and that's still ongoing. Brian's working on another manuscript highlighting kind of the pattern and dynamics of this invasion process, if you will. And, so you've got this bird. They're spectacular, look very tropical. It's very convenient because birders will identify them unambiguously, and so we don't get that confusion about identification. And so it's great to study in that way, but it's showing up in places where it hasn't been before. And in fact, in some of these areas in the northern part of its current range, there were no medium-bodied jays, at least very commonly. And so there's a new player in that environment, and how is it affecting other species? Well, one thing, the most unexpected thing that Brian told you about is that we found a hybrid between green jay and blue jay. So green jays and blue jays are moving. Both of their ranges are expanding. Blue jays have been invading. They came to Austin maybe in the 1970s or so, and they've still continued down towards San Antonio. And these two species are now intermingling. And I'd often speculated and wondered about, would they be antagonistic to each other? And in fact, they were less than antagonistic to each other. They produced some offspring. This is probably a one-off bird. I mean, I would love it if there was a new hybrid zone here. That would be tremendously exciting. But because of their behavior and interactions, I suspect it may become rare as the populations grow larger in the ranges where they interact. But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe more will show up. But we could prove that was a hybrid through genetics and so on. So autonomous sensing, we have this model where we want to have these sensors connected so that we know they're still running, mainly, but that they can communicate results back, especially in situations where we want near real-time information, updates. Some new bird may appear, and it would be nice to get a text on your phone saying, "Oh, something from a motmot from Mexico has finally shown up in Texas." Embedded computing, we use edge computing to do AI kernels and identify bird species and other sounds as they're being recorded. And then we want these to be sort of long-term monitoring site sentinels that are self-sufficient, that we don't have to service them on a weekly basis, for example, which takes a lot of time and effort if these are distributed And then we have this idea, we're not very far down that road, but sort of adaptive. It would be really nice if as new information comes in, we can sort of do some computation to better understand changes that are happening. So we built this BioSense platform, and as I mentioned before, it records a number of things. And through collaborations, Planet Texas 2050, we've also learned about how to measure soil, and so we do moisture sensors off of these as well. Deployments we've done mostly now in the UT field station network. That's where this project originated. We've done all 7 of the field stations from the coast in Port Aransas to McDonald Observatory in the Davis Mountains and sites in between. So, and a number of other places. This was a workshop that we did last summer where we taught some Ecuadorian students about the platform and how to set it up and manage it at Tipitini Biodiversity Station in the Western Amazon. So we do bioacoustics, and so when the sound comes in, people have developed quite elaborate technology to identify these pictures of sound. A sonogram is a picture of sound and just shows you the frequency on the vertical axis and time on the x-axis, and you run that through an image recognition, and it's pretty darn good. I mean, so we can identify things like a sooty antbird in Tipitini. Danush talked before about the trees project, but I find this incredibly exciting, both because it embodies a really great collaboration with Dave and others in this group and Mark, but also the potential is to use remote sensing, GIS, ground-based sensing, inventory data, and a bunch of things to build a truly detailed dynamic map of the forest of Austin that we can look and see how it changes through time and associate those changes with different kinds of disturbances and influences. And so I think that's a really exciting project, and I will stop there. And thanks to all these people and all these folks. Thank you.
So I'll pick up right where he left off. In some ways, like understanding the health of those trees, we can translate that to policy and practice, right? We can better understand where wildfire mitigation might happen. We can better understand if where an ice storm comes, are those trees going to be in bad shape to take down power lines? What's the absorption capacity of stormwater? So I think it's really neat how that all these projects connect to each other in different ways. And I think that's something that's so beautiful about Planet Texas. So when I first arrived at UT, I was an environmental sociologist in a school of public affairs, and nobody really knew what to do with me. Don't tell anyone, but I had never taken a public administration class. And it took me a while. I always did interdisciplinary work, but where I was previously, it was more with ecologists, foresters, some hydrologists. And I didn't really know where I fit in at UT until Planet Texas kicked off. I'd never collaborated with engineers. I'd never collaborated with geoscientists. And the way that we came together to kind of build a coherent community of practice around this work has been incredibly inspiring. I think this is my 7-slide presentation, but I also put together a 47-slide presentation, so we'll see what happens. I got really, in my spiel right there, I got really nostalgic about thinking about all the work that we've done over the last 7 or 8 years. And I figured if I ever was going to try to document it, now was the time. So I'm a co-lead for the flagship Networks for Hazard Preparedness and Response. My partner is Paula Pasalacqua, who is now not with us, but in a really good way, she's in Zurich. And so when we first got together, which was also a really kind of odd occurrence, I was in a dissertation defense committee. I had never met her before. She said something about networks, and then I said, "Oh, you do networks? I do networks." And we just hit it off, just like that, thinking about the different ways we may integrate technical, hydrological, and social science through that lens. So when we set out, the problem we set out to solve was trying to better identify and address the gaps in hazard preparedness. There was a clear lack of integration between technical modeling and social scientists. I write articles in the International Journal for Disaster Risk Reduction, so I do risk reduction. She writes articles for hazards research, and those two disciplines typically don't speak together. It's really, really fascinating. And then beyond that, this flagship, and we both had this real desire to connect to stakeholders and develop tools, research questions that are very much aligned with translating science to action and making something different on the ground. So we kind of thought about this in two different ways. A couple of different geographies that we picked right off the bat, Southeast Austin and Southeast Texas. And then this idea of how do we start with flooding, but turn it into something bigger that's related to cross-hazard, multi-hazard, different types of learning hubs around hazards. And part of that was to try to understand, are there underlying workflows, underlying data sets that can translate from one hazard to the next? This is kind of a rough general trajectory of the work, but over time, we've got 35 publications, have raised $17 million in external funding, and deployed over 200 new sensors in one of our study sites. So, every year we kind of are doing something a little bit different. Took a couple years to get off the ground, and then things went really well for Paula mainly. She got that big Department of Energy grant. And so one of the things I was really interested, like I mentioned, is just bringing stakeholders together. How do we start better building relationships, folks at UT with decision makers at the state level, county level, regional level? And so this was kind of an effort to bring those folks to a room for a real informal conversation, but talk about what's on their mind around flooding, heat, wildfire, water quality, what kind of research could be helpful, what kind of data could be helpful, and trying to identify ways that we could contribute to this conversation in a systematic way. And that's kind of where we started to understand, some of this stuff is really transferable, workflows, data sets, et cetera. So we held some hazard hubs. At one point, we kind of came up with this, and somebody was mentioning this, maybe Mark, kind of came up with a framework. I don't know that this is super novel, but I had never seen anything like it that talks about the different phases of the disaster cycle, and then really trying to identify those leverage points. Where are those leverage points to better mitigate, better respond, better build adaptive capacity within this hazard cycle? And for the most part, shocks or stressors, most hazards kind of follow this type of framework. I just lost my thought. So anyway, so then when we started building, and I think these leverage points happen at the places where Mark was talking about. How do we reduce exposure? How do we decrease sensitivity or vulnerability, social vulnerability to the impact? How do we build adaptive capacity? What are those levers, and at what point in this phase can we start to tweak those levers to change the system? Ultimately, we got to transform the way we're doing this, the way we think about it, our mental models about hazards, if we're ever really going to make a difference. And so we started building some maps. Our approach was to build multiple layers and see how they start to stack on top of each other. So one of those layers is just the flooding. We did some fluvial flood modeling, and then on top of that, overlaid social vulnerability. So our second layer was like a static social layer. So trying to think the technical, the hydrological, the social. How do we start to stack layers on top of each other? And this was developed into a reusable workflow that can be developed geographically specific social vulnerability indices. And these flood maps, inundation maps, that include both fluvial and pluvial flooding. A part of that, I kind of skipped over it, but we do like to always claim this pin to flood solution. I think I'll talk about it here in a second, which is a really great emergency management tool that was developed by Paula a little bit before I came in, but I still like to claim I'm a part of it. And so that was, we were about, 4 years into it, and all of a sudden we got a flood of grants, and it was really amazing. I was the PI on a NASA Equity and Environmental Justice grant focused in Austin, and Paolo was the PI on a Department of Energy urban integrated field lab in Beaumont. 4 urban areas in the entire country were awarded, and Beaumont was one of those 4. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Coastal flooding, river flooding, so much rain, air pollution, heat, right? So you really have this situation where you're not just dealing with flooding, you're dealing with combined compound hazards. So I think just kind of looking forward, I'm very proud. Again, this was sort of that compilation. It's kind of in different documents that we have in SharePoint. Heidi, you were probably like, what is he doing in SharePoint? Because it's like moving things around. And anyway, but from the academic side, we've been very successful. And I love how this is, I believe, a testament to the type of catalyst funding for interdisciplinary work that does pay off. But more than that, I think we're really now focused on how do we translate the research, translate what we've learned into policy, into practice, into tools, into education. So that's kind of where we're focused on now. So we're working on the statewide deployment of some of the emergency response tools. Part of this kind of process, we developed a flood-specific social vulnerability indicator for the Texas Water Development Board. That's being integrated into the regional planning. We're working on some curriculum development or capacity building development modules at the hydrological social science intersection across a variety of topics. We're working with Adam on integrating some of these maps that have been built into the heritage hazard map. So how do we build that flood layer into a map of archaeological heritage, places of community importance, to better understand where should we be responding? A lot of this work has to do with how can we identify in real time or very quick time where the most need is, where should we be responding based on cultural resources, based on underserved communities, et cetera. Then we've always had this vision of a Texas disaster decision theater. I don't think it's ever going to happen, but if anybody has $150 million, I can build you a disaster decision theater where multiple stakeholders can come in, deal with some scenarios, right, and make decisions. How are you going to do that? How are you going to make those decisions? What are those criteria that come to the fore? That's all I've got. There's a little bit of a chart. The total activities on the left side: publications, presentations, grants applied, community meetings, grants received, hazard hubs, and then how that tracked over the years. And again, I would love to do this. I kind of mentioned this for all the flagships, because there's probably a pretty similar pattern, right? It takes a couple of years. I don't know. We might have the biggest line there at year 3, but but it takes a couple of years. And so I think there's some really cool stuff we can learn by thinking about what it took to get to the products and like the mechanisms it took to get to the products, and then how long did that take? Because it takes time. It takes a lot of time. But anyway, thank you.
I was hoping it was me next because I have a bunch of stuff that I can piggyback on with what Patrick was just talking about. So if you were here earlier, you noticed that I said that I'm an archaeologist and I don't even work in Texas. And I represent the sort of past component. So all of the stuff that the other panelists are doing is not what I do. And all of the things that they are presenting now have to do with either collecting new information that assists in decision-making or facilitating processes of decision-making about the present and what is happening now. I don't do any of those things. All of the new data that I create has to do with the ancient past in other parts of the world. But as one of the members of the Planet Texas Organizing Committee, I spent a lot of time thinking about where the work that we do might intersect with the work that everybody else is doing about the present and the future. And this really didn't come together until relatively recently, one of the things we were doing in Texas was working with the Texas Archaeological Research Laboratory, which maintains the state site files for rescue excavations for archaeology across the state. And we were doing some various things related to paleoclimate, and occasionally early on, some mapping work that then we sort of left alone. But as Planet Texas developed, and as I learned more about what other people were doing, I started to realize that there might be a place where our work would intersect with some of the planning for risk and impact work that people like Patrick and Paula were doing. And I want to point out the article that Patrick mentioned that he wrote with Paula and Matt Pricer about overlaying flood mapping and social vulnerability. So that's a way of combining two different kinds of data to see places where the community might be more vulnerable in terms of its social factors like age or income or disability, and also more vulnerable in terms of flooding. And if I can call us back to Mark's presentation, when Mark said you do an inventory, right, in your decision tree, you make an inventory of your critical resources. Like archaeology said nobody ever. Right? He did not mention the cultural heritage of Austin. He mentioned roads, communication, water, electricity, the things that keep a city functioning in the present. But it is the case that our past, the remains of the people who lived before us in the places where we live, are also really important parts of our cultural identity and our communities. And there are a number of other projects that have been going on for the last decade or so as people really started to understand the magnitude of the changes that climate change would bring, to look at the effect on heritage, either archaeological sites or monuments or tourist attractions, in places that were particularly vulnerable to climate change. And this is mainly focused on coastal areas, sea level rise, storm surge. So I point out an article that came out almost 10 years ago now about the effect of sea level rise and climate change on coastal sites in the US, which was possible because this group had assembled a whole bunch of state site files on archaeological sites from different states and put them together in something called the Digital Index of North American Archaeology. And Texas is only partially part of this, but it occurred to us as we were working on Planet Texas 2050 that Texas, the size of a small country, or the size of a medium-sized country, right? We're the size of France, has all of these files, so we do know where people have been documenting sites in the state of Texas. And this is another one that just came out last year about Bangladesh and coastal sites, risk from flooding, storm surge, sea level rise, climate change factors. So at this point, we started saying, hey, what if we took some of the work that these other groups are doing on flooding, on risk and hazards, social vulnerability, and combined that with some of the information that we have collected about archaeological sites, or that we're just borrowing from Tarl. So what I'm talking about here is really the reuse and integration of a bunch of things that other people produced. I want to be very clear about that. But in doing that, we can add to these maps and dashboards that drive policy and decision-making at the city level a layer related to the cultural resources that reflect our history and our identity, or the identity and history of specific communities. So what you're looking at is a map that combines flooding risk in a very basic way, as defined by the height above the nearest drainage maps that have been done, wildfire risk, and social vulnerability, with some publicly available data sets of places that are on the National Register of Historic Places, places that are on the list of Texas landmarks, and a data set of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums that was publicly available. And we used those in combination with those risk and hazard maps to create an overlay that scores these hexagonal cells by their exposure and risk to these various factors, as well as the social vulnerability index. And this is a little bit complicated, but basically these things are being represented on two axes. So if you look at that little diamond shape at the bottom, the axis of social vulnerability is on the left, and the axis of the risk imposed by natural hazards is on the right. So the things that are at the top of that little triangle are high social vulnerability, high risk to climate hazards. The things that are on the left side are high risk to climate hazards but low social vulnerability. The things that are on the right side are low risk of climate hazards but high social vulnerability. No, I reversed that. Sorry. The things that are on the right side are high risk to climate hazards, low social vulnerability. The things that are on the left are higher social vulnerability, lower risk to climate hazards. And the reason that some of you were like, no, you've got that backwards, is because you're looking at this map and you know that the east side of Austin is higher social vulnerability, the west side of Austin is lower social vulnerability, right? So the map right away tells you, like, okay, no, if you're talking about blue and yellow, we're talking about low social vulnerability. But you do have places where there is both flooding risk and fire risk at the urban wildlife interface. Whereas over down here in the area of Onion Creek, you've got high social vulnerability and high exposure to climate-related hazards like flooding and wildfire. So if we go down to that area, on the coarsest level, this is a quick visual tool. And you'll notice I don't have a lot of words in my presentation. This is a piece of visual rhetoric. If it works, then I did well. And if it doesn't, then tell me what's missing or how to explain it better, because this is what we're trying to do at this point. But what you can see here is a really quick assessment of what areas are at the highest risk and the highest vulnerability. So just to quickly run through that, staying in this area around the east side of Austin near the river, what you can see is the social vulnerability by census tract, with lighter regions being more socially vulnerable. You can see the fire, the burn risk from the fire maps that have been made around Austin. The more red, the more risk of fire there is, the more trees and flammable material. And you can see a hand map in which the darker regions are higher above the nearest drainage and the lighter regions are lower. So the lighter you are, the more you're in a floodplain or somewhere that's going to be affected by water level rise. So once you put those things together, you can see that some of these red areas, right, where we have a couple of sites, are more at risk. The part that was missing, I realized during the last Planet Texas Symposium. And I realized it during a workshop that Patrick had put together on community asset mapping. And what was missing here was not just things that are on the National Register of Historic Places and Texas landmarks, which are highly selected for according to a number of factors, but they often concentrate in wealthier areas. They focus on particular parts of American history, but also things that were not going to appear on a list that communities felt to be important. So the part of this that we're working on now is starting to understand how we can integrate information collected from communities, ideally in collaboration with city offices for Travis County, where we're piloting this map. The idea is to then extend this process to the whole state. So I was a participant in Becky Pettit's Home to Texas project over this last summer, which was an undergraduate research project that sent first-year students back to their communities in Texas to collect data for faculty projects. So I sent folks back and said, hey, find 4 places that are built environments subject to risks from fire and flood that are important to your community, that people would be sad to see go. Because around this time, we also had the fires in Pasadena and Altadena. And in Altadena in particular, it turned out there were a whole lot of cultural resources that had not really been mapped or documented that were burned to a crisp. So if people had known, they might not have been able to save those places, but it would have helped to develop some disaster management plans, some plans for moving collections, some plans for documenting existing buildings and monuments. So this was a sort of an inspiration in terms of thinking about what's important to the community. And this is where Mark's suggestion about, no data without stories comes in. So we're working on that. We are working also on a way to obfuscate sensitive data. We started with the set of archaeological sites, but the problem is that those sites are not public information and restricted by state law in terms of who can see them and use them, because you could just go dig them up for arrowheads or something if you wanted to. So we're trying to figure out strategies that would allow us to obfuscate by blurring essentially the values, the risk and hazard values of those sites into larger cells depending on other factors. In this case, it's population density, right? So as you move out to the west, there somewhere in that yellow blur are 1 or 2 archaeological sites, but that's a big yellow blur. Downtown, there are smaller blurs, but those are also densely populated, densely built up areas where you're unlikely to be able to go and loot an archaeological site in the middle of Republic Square Park or something.
1 more minute?
This is it. I'm actually like 2 more minutes over my 1 minute. In any case, what our next step is to work with the City of Austin Planning and Historic Preservation Office with Kara Bertrand as part of a city collab grant to start figuring out how we can add community-generated data, solicit community-generated data, make this dashboard useful to people who are actually doing planning and managing disasters in the city so that those cultural features are taken into account, perhaps not on the same level as the electrical grid or our water supply, but as part of the conversation, because those things are part of our understanding of ourselves as a community, and also so that people can start planning. If you know that your library is going to flood the next time you get a big rain, maybe you make some plans about how you can move things out of the library or how you can protect them. So this is, again, as all of these other projects have been, a massively interdisciplinary effort with a lot of partnerships. And I want to, I didn't list the people, but I probably should have. I want to call out the Historic Preservation Office of the City of Austin, the Texas Advanced Computing Center that has been supporting the development of this dashboard, UT Libraries, whose GIS librarian has also been working on this with us, Preservation Austin, whom we are hoping to work with as a partner in finding out about community resources, and Tarl, UT Planet Texas itself, without which I would not be doing this because, again, I don't work on the present and I don't work in Texas. So the opportunity to actually think through how I can contribute to decision-making that preserves cultural heritage in the place where I live is a direct result of this broader project that I would not have come to otherwise. Thank you.
First of all, hi. The hi is very important, and I'm going to tell you why. Is this my slide? No. Okay, then this is my slide. All right. I think you heard a lot of things. You heard things like city, network, localization, data to decisions, which I call D2D. You heard about automation, decisions, grants, scenarios. And I don't think any meeting will be complete unless you hear the word AI. So here I am to say AI. Now we are done. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is essentially how do we take everything that is being done here by all these amazing people and what they represent behind them and with them, and they are following a large group which has about 100 people or so that are working on these problems across academia, across communities, across city, and we have several of them here as well right now. One of the things that we are trying to then do is that how do we create this into a digital representation of where we can then start having the ability to scale this, apply this somewhere else, and then help create the knowledge that has been generated here to be useful beyond this particular group. How do you do that? And this is where the idea comes up, what if I could clone Patrick, and what if I clone Mark, and what if I clone, all this amazing thing that Tim is doing, and Adam and Oscar and so forth. So rather than cloning, let's use the word twinning. And that's where this idea of digital twinning comes up. That what if we can take all this knowledge, all that we have learned together, and start putting it into a framework that somehow with the artificial intelligence, that seems to be the magic word, help us to try and put this into a framework that can be scalable, transferable, transposable, and then also making something that is useful. That is the broader challenge that we are dealing with right now. So Collab, something you heard from Mark as to how we are building this as a human partnership. And then there's a digital part of it, and that's where we are trying to go. So I said hi, and that I'll explain why. So I was at this summit about 2 weeks back in India. This was the AI summit in Delhi. And there were about 250,000 people at that AI summit, yeah. And there were about 200 or 300 of them at the CEO summit and the country head summit. And you had people like Sam Altman and the Anthropic CEO and so forth. You probably saw the picture. They didn't hold hand and they crossed their hands and so forth. But that was that. And then there was a who's who of AI, like people like Lacan and so forth, who apparently have million citations. I mean, can you beat that? Million citations for their work. And they were all there. And what I was finding is AI. And what gave me most joy was when somebody came and said hi. And that hi to me is HI, which is human interaction and human intelligence. And what we are trying to do in a digital twin framework is try to put that AI with the human inferences or the human interactions and try to pull all this together. This, because we are doing it in Austin, and Patrick likes to come up with cool acronyms, we are calling this Austwin. Yeah. When we were doing it for UT, we were calling it UTwin. We are very creative here. So here's where we are trying to go into this version of a digital twinning of the Collab, so to say, or everything that we have learned thus far in the context of where we are. And it starts with, all the experts like we have Oscar and others who are trying to do part of it. So I'm going to give you some examples about how we are starting to put all these things together. One of which is, say, let's take all this data that we have about building heights, LiDAR. We have information about working with different groups. And if you start putting all this information together, and if you create this for a campus, this is the U-twin on the left, and you could query each building and try to ask the question, how much energy is being used, what is the carbon footprint, and what it will be in the future. So that you can then start thinking about whether you need to have a particular building to be retrofitted with better energy use aspect, or do you need to start doing some energy transformation there? That kind of a question. So, but first you need to start measuring and understanding where we are and then come up with the scenarios about where it could be in a future world and what actions you could take. So you could start doing this kind of a digital dashboard in terms of just getting a sense and putting things on a quantitative aspect. You heard Mark say it, that when he goes to the departments and when they say, should I continue this $1 million project? You should say, yes, give it to us. Yeah, but I think the question really is that what they're looking for is numbers. They're looking for data. They're looking for ways that they can start building information. They're looking for intelligence. No one looks for just, I'd say, weather forecast. Weather forecast is only useful when it helps you make a decision. Do I carry an umbrella? Do I go out? Do we have a wedding outside? Do we have a wedding inside? Those sort of decisions, day-to-day decisions. Yep. But trying to move beyond that forecast stage to decision in a weather forecasting, which is what I do, is where our challenge lies right now. And we are looking at it in the more longer term, that for the cities or for the departments, that how do we just help create the data sets, how do we help create the indices that can actually help with the decision, and that is a co-production process, where we are trying to, first of all, understand what is it that they are trying to solve. And that's where the translation starts coming into the picture. Many years back, working with the agriculture community, we did a project called Making Climate Information Useful to Usable. That was U to U. All climate research that we thought we were doing is useful, but almost nothing was usable. Because unless you are going to connect it with somebody who is going to come up with a decision, it was not useful. And so the usability came up with a dashboard, with a decision framework or something like that, and that's where we started going. Now we are moving to data to decision, or this D to D, from U to U. That's where we are. But when we start talking about D to D or data to decision, the first question that comes up, where is the data? We have a lot of data, and again, we fall into the same thing. We have a lot of data which is useful but not usable. We have a lot of data which is supposed to be out there but not accessible. And we have a lot of data that even if it is out there and accessible, we don't know what to do with it. And even if we know what to do with it, we don't know what will be the use of what we have generated and who is going to use it. So the cycle actually continues. So even though when we say we have a lot of data, the question still is about how do you make that data useful to usable, and that's one of the area we are working in. An example of that we had temperature data sets. But temperature is not something that we experience. What we experience is thermal comfort. If you have the same temperature standing in sun is going to be very different than standing in shade. If you have the same temperature, but when there is a wind coming on you, it's going to feel different than what it is not in that. So the thermal comfort. So it's a new kind of data set. So we have been generating these new data sets and using all the information that we can get from limited data sources and use the power of machine learning and AI and generate the maps across the globe in terms of what we call thermal scapes. One of the first data product that we created is a thermal scape for Austin, which is at 5 feet by 5 feet temperature map for Austin. So you can see where you might want to have hot spots, cold spot, where do you put trees, where do you come up with ways that parts of the buildings are going to be heated. We even look at it in terms of ice risk now, that there are going to be places where if you're not getting enough sunlight, you can have the ice staying on the pavement, and that can become a risk and so forth. So that's something we have started initially working with the context of developing thermal maps and data set. Now, part of that, when we develop the software, then people like Naveen and Trevor and others who are at the back, they put this software together and essentially said, we can make this available to everyone. So within 1 month, we have had over 1,000 downloads of this particular software, where people are now applying this to places in Phoenix, places in other places to come up with a thermal scape that is over other places, where you can take a thermal map and generate your own high-resolution maps going on with it. Like what Dhanush showed, for instance, with trees, trying to go from the forest to tree. We are going from city to building and trying to build up from that particular part. Then working with Mark and others, we asked this question. Recently, we have been involved with a study with my collaborator in Georgia, where hurricanes, we know, have one problem. We have rain, we have winds, we have been developing hazards and resilience to that. One of the biggest unknown problem that follows with a hurricane is that with the temperatures. If you have a power loss and a heat wave, which is what happened in Houston recently, that is where we had more fatalities than what would have happened with flooding. And so this unmet need associated with some of these new hazards coming up, and how do we then start putting all these things together? Your home, you're supposed to be safe. You're supposed to feel safe than being exposed to elements outside. But what happens if your home is going to actually be way more dangerous than being out in the middle of a heat wave? And this is because you're using wrong material. The house has been old and is not causing enough comfort for you. And so this is an area where we try to see, and there was a study that was done, and it figured that if you look into the future climate, and if you don't do anything in Austin right now, about 85% of the homes in Austin are vulnerable to extreme heat. And that will be a problem. So we need to start thinking about developing some passive cooling and some kind of engineering aspects. And this is an example of digital twinning, that where do you prioritize, where do you start putting this information in terms of what kind of housing and what kind of future policies the city can look into. Some others, like Adi and other who is here, they have been developing a project with NASA in taking all this data set and asking the question, everyone uses a Google map right now and say, I want to go from point A to point B. But what if it can tell you, if you walk from point A, you'll be in more shade than going somewhere else? And so we developed this Cool Path app. And that Cool Path app, so you can actually go from here to, say, downtown, and there will be a 40% chance you'll be more in shade if you take this path A versus path B. This small exposure that you will avoid to heat can be the difference between what you can feel tired or productivity and well-being that you're looking for. And if you start applying it in the broader sense, this is really technology that you're starting to use from humans to communities to cities and framework that we're going forward. So when we are trying to come up with this whole UTCity Collab framework, it is not simply about taking these individual projects and having this fun, which we absolutely have working together. It is not simply about taking the small projects and then trying to pitch something new for the city again next year. It is really part of this something big. And that something big that we are working towards is this digital twin that we have for the city, which is not just about AI, which is not just about technology. It is absolutely about people and the city's well-being. And it is where we start putting humans, decisions, data, technology all together. This is what we have been doing through Planet Texas. This is what we are doing through CoLab. This is what we are trying to build in terms of the partnerships going forward. Using the best of the technology, best of the science, best of the academia, and the best of the intents and actions that are required by the community with the best of the people who can actually invest time into this as a second job as if that they have to do, working with the academia, with us, and trying to build a best city, because there's nothing as a second alternative. Even if we create a digital twin, we still need one Austin that is going to be awesome. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dave. Let's give a round of applause to all our amazing panelists. Okay, so this is aimed at all our panelists. What does it take to actually move from data and models to decisions that get implemented, and where are the biggest bottlenecks in that translation?
How many of you in here think that data actually informs most decisions? Political, yeah, if you're thinking about the city or the state. Yeah.
You got one hand, Patrick.
I mean, so I think the question in and of itself, oh, yeah.
A little.
Yeah, a little, yeah.
I think it depends on the type of data that you have. Is it numbers? Is it people's opinions? Or is it like a community based? Or is it like just engineers working on it and creating numbers? It depends on the type of data that you're creating.
That's great. Mark? Because Mark always says, no data without a story, no story without the data, right? So I think that's a really good answer.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. I'm glad you asked that question because, yeah, that is a really tough question to answer. I like the saying, and I think it was Dr. George Stone who said that all models are wrong, that some are useful. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, if you think about council makes decisions based on community feedback, and then we have directors make decisions on the 200 people they have below them, and then we have assistant directors, division managers, project managers. Everybody's making decisions all day long, and they all use their own data. Like engineers use engineering, metrics, and planners use demographics. We all use data all the time, but the same way that you make a decision in your daily lives, you don't always track the data you're using. You don't always log it. You make a decision, you move on. And it's hard to be like, stop. What are you doing? What are you doing right now? What data are you actually using? What data should you be using? I don't do that on a day-to-day basis. I'm not going to ask staff to do that because it's just, they're not going to talk to me ever again. So how do you sort of slow down the system, look at it, and then see where to actually fit stuff in is challenging.
So I think the question was about how do you actually move from data to decision, right? That was the first question. And then Patrick put a twist to that question, asking, do we use data at all right now to some extent? And so I think the point I wanted to just raise is that in weather community, we have this quite a bit. And there's a thing called data assimilation, that you get intermittent information and you try to guide the process towards reality or truth, whatever that may be. And I think that is a well-proven approach that you can do rather than data inundation. If you can sufficiently provide just the right information at the right time for the right decision, people might actually use it. And so this is where we have been trying to create something called a data decision tool, that who needs the information, for what purpose, in what format, and why. If you can just give that very limited data information, people might actually use it. One of the most annoying things my daughter tells me when I ask her anything is like, she says, just Amazon it or Google it up. I'm like, that's half the world out there. I need something very specific. And that is exactly what people need. Give me something which is very specific for the thing I'm going to do, and I might use that data. Otherwise, it's just a good resource, but not a data. But if we can make that translation, I think that is where our challenge is right now, that crisply identifying that data decision cycle and data decision framework. That's one. The second part I would say is where I think everyone needs to come in is
we do micro projects and we call success. The impact. Putting 10 trees is not going to cool Austin. Is 10 million the answer? If so, where? And how? And so forth. So the scale of that impact and really becoming bold and impactful is where I think we need to be, rather than having this micro successes, defining and saying achieved. And so that lack of bold vision and really this big impact view is what I think is stopping us right now from really moving. But that's just an academic view, and I'll have more practical people talk about it.
So I think I love that so much of the work that we all do is really downscaled. We work with neighborhoods, we work with community groups, right? Can it be localized? But then what else do you need if you're trying to work with a community or a community group? You've got to have that relationship. So I think one of my big answers is like, how do you make this work? It's social capital. I'm a sociologist. You need trust. You need those networks. You need strong ties. You need weak ties. And you need those kind of in the right configuration in order for somebody to say, hey, that's really good data right when I need it, and I'm going to use it to help inform this decision. So I've never really fleshed that idea out until just now, but I think that social capital is like a really important factor that helps the data get to the decision maker, get to actually being implemented.
All right, maybe we can move on to another upvoted question here. So it's, what are the risks of over-relying on technical solutions for what are fundamentally social or political problems?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's a really excellent point in that we need not only robustness and resilience in our systems that we build and live in and so on. We need that in the decision framework and so on. And technology, there is a sort of rule in engineering and is that the more highly optimized you are, the less resilient you are in some cases, right? And so technology can be alluring in terms of its capacity for optimization, but that can form very narrow solutions. And so I think you really have to have this more holistic view and bring in more signals and more input from people broadly to be careful about over-reliance on the technology. And I think also that some of the approaches that have been discussed, I do a lot of simulation, and Dave was talking about digital twins and so on. That is a process that is not necessarily engineering optimization per se with its sort of Achilles heel, but that does allow for exploration, gaming, and much broader array of different kinds of scenarios and decisions. And that's very useful to ensure some greater resiliency and robustness in that process and not get trapped into this, perfection technological optimal solution that may be very fragile in some cases.
I do want to jump in here, and so thank you, Tim. I gave the example earlier of the 2013 Halloween flood, where the water came in so fast that it took out the sensors, but then when people called 911 at 2 o'clock in the morning, the 911 operators look at the maps and didn't see any flooding, so emergency management was 3 hours late. So I think that's one case where we take data a little too seriously. But I think also you've seen a lot of GIS maps, and I don't mean to criticize GIS maps, but I look at those maps and sometimes I know those areas have 1,000 people live in the blocks, and sometimes 20,000 people live in the blocks. And just because we show these maps doesn't really show what's happening on the ground. So whatever data we use, we have to ground truth it. Either go to that location, talk to those people, make sure it's right, because just because we have it doesn't mean we should use it, even if it looks good.
I want to add something from a different perspective, which has less to do with technological solutionism and more to do with this question of data again. We are obviously dealing with problems that are social and political. And it is true that data in and of itself, if it is useful but not usable, is not that helpful for this, and there are biases in the data. However, one of the issues in the sort of social and political barriers to solving problems is differential amounts of information or bad information. And I think that one part of this is actually about ensuring that, to the extent that you can, obviously, you're collecting good information, but that it is also well described and interoperable and can be reused by other people and stored in other places. Because if you have multiple places where data sets are living, then there is not one failure point where somebody decides to maybe scrub that data off the one site that had it on the internet and now you don't have it anymore. And we are living through this with respect to carefully collected, well-described, interoperable federal government data. So this is, I think, another piece of the equation. It's true. I'm not a technological solutionist, but I do think that having more well-preserved, better described data is helpful to us. And I think that that's one of the things that, I'm taking away from this conversation.
All right. Let's see if there's any updates here. I guess I can ask, when you're mapping risks, how do you handle trade-offs between accuracy, uncertainty, and usability?
You do the best you can. I think building those maps. So one example that I wish I would have shown, and this is actually a good example of the social capital facilitating usage of the data, is 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we built a multi-hazard map of Austin. So we looked at wildfire, flooding, and heat. And heat. Not air quality. It was too complicated. Too much uncertainty. And then social vulnerability. So we were able to lay, looking at census block groups across the city of Austin, are there places that are both exposed to compound hazards, and highly social vulnerable? And if so, how can we think about strategies, to increase adaptive capacity, reduce exposure, reduce sensitivity? And that, I'm totally not going to answer your question, and this is on purpose. But that's such a good example that this little map that, was pretty static. It wasn't very dynamic, but it had all this information. And Mark would frequently, I would check, I wouldn't really check much, but every now and then I would check, are people going to use it, looking at this? And it'd be 37 people looked at it this month. They were all Mark. But they'd be having a meeting and trying to decide about how to prioritize or strategize about a certain infrastructure investment. Mark would pull this map up. Does this help us? Does this help us think about what we should do? Where should we do it? So I don't know. I guess in that case, they were pretty simple methods. It wasn't high resolution modeling that produced these kind of exposure patterns. So it's sort of the simplicity, but I think it kind of maybe made a little bit more usability. I don't know. And oftentimes, when you're trying to integrate data sets, you're limited in the types of applications, the types of methodologies that you can take. With that, it was sort of we've got to cram a heat exposure metric into a census block group because that's where we have our social data from. And I know there's new ways and other ways to think about it, but it's pretty complicated, that spatial resolution alignment of different types of data.
I tend to think of maps as conversation starters. Hey, where do we even start this conversation? Where do we even start to look at? But then once you have that conversation, you don't need to go back to the map. You kind of already know. But then you get into a little bit more detail, where should we focus on this neighborhood? Where should we focus on the house? It's usable at the beginning of every conversation, but it should not be the end result in itself.
When we published that, we actually published it under the framework of using it as a boundary object. Really, the paper was about boundary objects being types of things that bring people together to have conversations. And so yes, we explained the methodology of the map, but really the whole paper was framed around this kind of map as a boundary object to bring multiple stakeholders to the same conversation.
All right. I don't know who this question is directed to, but I think it's for everybody. What is your dream collaboration or data set in planning for resiliency? What is your dream collaboration or data set in planning for resiliency?
I'm happy to state I'm living the dream.
Well, of course, we always want all the data that could be ever collected, but so naming one is quite a challenge. But I do think we have information about. I mean, one thing that sort of comes to mind, even though we do have a lot of information about it, but truly high quality information about human movement in the environment actually would be extremely useful, and those exist, but I think it could be much more detailed and scaled up to much larger kinds of data.
I mean, I think for dream collaboration, all I can think of is like what's on my mind right now. I really wish we could take events happening in other cities or other countries. Like I'm thinking about the LA fires, the Halloween fires, taking the lessons learned, bring them here and have them, staff take them seriously. But not just take it seriously, but understand the interdependence between departments and understand this is what we need to do next, because it will happen here. I don't know if it's a dream collaboration as much as just my current frustration.
Okay, I think we can squeeze in one last question here. So I don't know who talked about this, but the question is, can you talk more about the pin to flood solution? What's its significance and how does it work?
Yeah, that's great. That's an easy answer. So maybe we can have time for one more. So an emergency responder goes to the edge of the flood extent, drops a pin, and within the app on their phone, it'll model the extent of the flooding area based on low cost, low resolution application of really high cost models, but it can do it, I don't know how long it takes, a couple seconds. And so that's the tool, right? So if I'm the first responder, drop a pin, the flooding's probably gonna really extend way down this street. We don't need people evacuating that way. We don't need emergency responders coming that way. So that's the tool. That's about all I know about it, to be honest. Here's this data to decisions thing. I would love, because that's been in use, to do some follow-up research and talk to people. Okay, how do you use it? What kind of information? That would be a really great case study of a modeling tool that turned into an application that people are using, but how are they using it? What do they get from it? Are they actually using it? Maybe nobody uses it anymore. I think it'd be really neat.
Just put a pitch for Alisa here, if you might have heard. That's part of a PhD, data to decision. She's worked with the fire, now with the flooding, to try to understand the data aspect of this. So if anyone has any follow-up question for us, please direct that. So.
All right, I think we have to conclude this panel. Thank you to all the panelists.